Well, I would like to welcome you to this new installment of A Few Minutes With, and it's a joy for me today to welcome back as my guest the Reverend Jan Fuller. Jan is an Episcopal priest. She's had a 40-year vocation as a college chaplain. She's currently serving as the director of the co-director, of the MA in Chaplaincy program at Hartford International University. But even more than that, I'm delighted she's a colleague of mine here in the Diocese of Southwestern Virginia. And even further back than that, we have a deeper connection as she was the college chaplain for my wife when she was a student at Hollins College, which I know the title's Hollins University, but to me it will always be Hollins College. So anyway, it's a joy to have her back with me. Jan, it's great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Matt. It's good to be with you. Appreciate it. And to have all these layered connections. That's wonderful.
Yes, the church is indeed a small place, and every day that goes by, it gets smaller. So
that's right. That's right.
Well, I'm especially glad you're here. Jan has a new book out. It's called Blessings for Your Students. It's a collection of prayers and some brief introductory chapters that Jan has written over the course of her vocation for multi-faith students in the context in which she's worked at different colleges around the country. And so I wanted to have her on to talk about this. And, you know, I know, Dan, this has been almost a lifetime project for you. So it's so nice to finally see this out. How did it feel to finally see this in print after all the work you put into it?
Well, I read through it with an old friend yesterday. And I was really amazed at, I remember the moments I wrote many of these prayers. Mm-hmm. But to see them in print is a wonder. I mean, it feels like the journey of a lifetime. It is a product of my professional life, and it has been so fun. It was such a relief to get it finished, at least enough to turn it over to church publishing instead of laying across my dining table. But it is, I think I'm very pleased with the book, and I'm pleased with how it turned out, and pleased that other people are interested in it. That makes me really glad.
Well, it's a great resource, and I'm so glad you mentioned it's the representation of a life's work. There are actually two foundational stones I see here that I wanted to talk to you briefly about. One, and you talk a little bit about this in the introduction, you spent much of your life up until your early 20s living in a multi-faith context in the Middle East. So talk a little bit about what that was like and having that as part of the focus that you brought when you moved back to the U.S.
Well, one of the things I love so I was part of a missionary family, but my parents, people have an idea of missions that all missionaries are evangelists, and some of them are caricatured as really ugly people who don't love the culture, who just want to change everything. And I was grateful to be parented by people who who went to the Middle East because they loved the culture and the people, and who never belittled it. So I feel really fortunate about that. But I was a little blonde girl, a tall blonde girl, in the midst of all these brown Muslim people. Mm-hmm. And many of the Americans that we knew lived in compounds so that they would see only each other, and so that their cultures got, in a way reproduced, but the missionaries didn't. And we lived in local neighborhoods. And so growing up, my best friend was a Palestinian Muslim, in a family of 4 sisters. And I would go over to her house and we would pray together in the back room. Her father would go to the mosque. Women don't have to go to the mosque, but there was a back room and we would say the prayers in the back room. So I learned to pray with the Sharabi girls, to put my head on the floor and to say the prayers. And so that was praying to me too. I didn't really see the harm in it. I didn't see, it was to me, putting my forehead on the ground before God, that seemed like a good thing to do always.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a moment, it sort of shaped my life then to, number one, not be afraid of Muslims. When I came back to the States, I began to realize, especially after 2001, that many Americans are skeptical, afraid of Muslims. And so beginning in 2001, while I was at Hollins, I realized that I needed to do some teaching about Islam and about other religions too, but that I had particular knowledge about this beautiful, honorable tradition that many Americans were afraid of and thought it was evil, or, the sort of going narrative was a wicked religion.
Mm-hmm.
So I spent a lot of time in the 2000s really trying to rebut that frame of mind. But the foundation was there. And that foundation then allowed me to build multi-faith chaplaincy and to say, well, if we're going to really develop our college students, then we have to develop them in this way too. And we have to teach them how to be in community with people who are unlike them in whatever kind of way. And so I have, I was raised with the lack of fear about people who are different from me. And so I think that plays itself out in the book, and that's one of the things I had hoped to accomplish. But I remain grateful as the years go by and the issues change as to what kind of difference are we willing to be in relationship with. I remain grateful for that foundation.
Well, and I think it does reflect well in the book, because there are a few sections as you're leading into the various chapters on, in fact, it's right after the introduction, you talk about a sensitivity in the multi-faith college community, which is primarily who this book is geared for, in the ways to not only close the prayer, but also open the prayer in ways of addressing, for us, God, Yahweh in the Jewish religion, Allah in the Islamic faith, but being sensitive to the different ways that you can incorporate that. So you do bring that across really well. Mm-hmm. Was it difficult?
Well, I did try in my prayers to more universally unbalance us all. I figure that we hear better, that we hear prayers better when we, contrary to our Episcopal way of doing things, when we hear something that surprises us or takes us a little off guard. So I thought it was a little bit equal opportunity to keep my audience off guard and to surprise them about who I might be speaking to. And it might even be them,
When you first moved back from the US, after having lived for so long in that multi-faith context, did you find the transition easier than you expected, or was it in some ways a little more difficult than you anticipated in coming back to, I presume, and you can talk about this, living in a much more homogenized faith community as opposed to what you experienced in the Middle East?
Well, I will say that it was very difficult, that I found the religious communities in America, number one, very internally focused, and I found them so isolated. And I knew when I was in seminary at Yale, I already knew that if I had to only work and live and talk to Christians, that I would have to, open a vein, or, I would have to do something drastic, because I just couldn't imagine life with only people. I mean, I recognize there's a great diversity in Christianity too, and I totally see that. But I thought, if you're only with Christians, then what do you have? You're very poor. And so the whole way that I've shaped my chaplaincy and the ministry to which I think I'm called has been a larger view. the other thing that I noticed when I came back to the States is that most Christians in America hadn't really thought about what is the essence of our faith? What's the bottom line? And when you live in a very religiously diverse setting, when the first question an Arab will ask you when they meet you is, what's your religion? And then they want to talk about your religion. Well, what do you do? And how do you practice? And one of the things that I began to understand about American Christianity is that most of the people that I would talk to didn't have a clue what Christianity was, didn't understand what was essentially Christian and what was cultural, which is part of the learning that you have when you're in conversation with people who are not Christians. And what part of that is just sort of the American thing, right? And so I was grateful as a child to be able to think about, so what is the basis of our faith and what is it? And also because Arabs don't talk about what they believe, they talk about what they do. The Islam is a religion of practice, as I think Christianity is too, but American evangelicals have talked about it as a way of believing correctly, which in a way I was shocked to understand as I came back to the States. I was shocked to realize that this is really about people telling you to believe the right thing instead of to do the right thing. So there was that conflict for me as I returned, not to mention that I had trouble remembering how to speak English sometimes, and I would, I'd go to Greek class, and I who knows what language would come out of my mouth because the culture shock was real, but that made then studying my own faith and my own tradition so much richer because I was looking for what was essential, and I think I challenge every Christian to wonder about what is essential in our faith and what can I do without, or what is just overlaid, not what can I do without, but what gets overlaid by our culture. So that we believe it's necessary, but maybe it isn't.
Well, and you touched on something important too about the willingness to even inquire or get a basic understanding about how other faiths operate. As you were talking, you may have gone to this in DC each year in September. There's an interfaith walk, basically, that starts in the large synagogue up near Washington National Cathedral. And over the course of the afternoon, you walk from the synagogue to the cathedral. And then as you walk down Massachusetts Avenue, you go to the Baha'i temple, you go to the Hindu temple, you go to the Islamic Center and hear the call to prayer and how that works. And then you end in a collective group gathering. And it was such a powerful thing to be at the Islamic Center with this huge multi-faith crowd, where inside you're listening to the call of prayer being broadcast over the speakers. And outside you have a rabbi blowing the shofar, all as a part of this inquisitive, questioning, educational tour. So there definitely is, I think, great value in just being willing and interested enough to ask those questions, which I think would help us as Christians better enunciate what it is we believe we should be doing and what it is about our faith that we hold important. Yeah,
for sure. For sure. That is a beautiful occasion and a beautiful impulse, because if we can be in relationship with people, it helps us to understand something about them in order to be in relationship.
Yeah. There is a quote that I want to read from the book, and it's about the role of the chaplain. It's on page 39. And it says, "The chaplain's public work in a community is often to speak the silently obvious, to name the pain we feel singly or together, to say the things no one else wants to risk, even to articulate what is unmentionable in polite company, like injustice, worry, death, and even love." That for what I understand about chaplaincy, and my only experience with chaplaincy was the hospital chaplaincy I did during seminary as part of my formation. But that, I think, encapsulates powerfully what a chaplain does, but it also conveys to me, as I was reading it, the enormity of what it is you as a college chaplain do, what college chaplains or any chaplain does, but almost the weight and the isolation that it carries. So could you talk a little bit about, not only the joyful aspects of being a chaplain, but also how you preserve yourself, especially in communities where you are the multi-faith chaplain. It's not one chaplain per religious community or faith community, but you're it. How do you preserve yourself and hold to the joys while not allowing yourself to get so overwhelmed by everything else that's going on?
Well, that's a big question. It's a good and big question. And so I'll first say that the chaplaining, solo chaplaining is very lonely business. And I made it a point because I think the only other role in a university, and this is where I have my major experience, but the only other role in the university for somebody who oversees and looks over the health and welfare of the whole community is the president. Mm-hmm. So the chaplain and the president. Now, once upon a time, chaplains reported directly to presidents. And before that, the presidents were clergy and, looked after the spiritual health of the universities themselves. But now chaplains don't report to presidents anymore. They report to deans of students or directors of diversity, inclusion, and equity, or service learning, or some otherwhere. And so I cultivated very strategically relationships with the president, mm-hmm. partly because I felt that I needed to support the president, but because our views of the university kind of matched. So I often found that now I couldn't be like personally close to the president. As the years went by, presidents got more walls and more people separating them. Mm-hmm. But the model was the same for me, that I needed to find somebody who had a similar viewpoint of the university or of the world. And so what kept me alive in all those years of solo chaplaining, like 24 years at Hollins, was to be in relationship with other chaplains who were single chaplains. So the national network of chaplains was hugely, hugely important to me. Mm-hmm. Because there I had friends I could talk about things with. I could call them on the phone. I could say, what would you do now? We could just commiserate about how difficult it was. Or how joyous it was. And so the second piece of that is that, so you and I were talking before you sort of entered into this broadcast about, I had a book launch at Hartford International University last week, and a student came who had been my first babysitter at Hollins, and with whom I have had a relationship for 30 years. Mm-hmm. That is a significant picture of the joys of chaplaining, because if chaplaincy is about relationship, and it's about relationships that don't end. It's mm-hmm. about relationships in which I've loved watching my students have children and then send them off to college. And some of them, at Elon, so it's been the joy of that. Those relationships don't end. I mean, you may think, well, I may never see this person again, but with the world as small as it is now, you often do. And so it's been, I often felt like it would take 10 years for a student to maybe see how she or he had grown in their college years. Mm-hmm. And on their 10th return to the campus where they had been a student, I might be able to ask or hear, what did your college years mean to you? And so the investment of that time in those lives would come back years later, and remind me that it had made a difference, that whatever I had done or not done. And so many alums would say to me, do you remember the time I asked you XYZ and you answered? And I'll be like, nope, I don't remember that. And they would say to me, well, I do. And here's what you told me.
Yeah.
And here's what I learned from that. They would cite these moments that had just, in my experience, been a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I had gone on to another moment after that. But it somehow had made a huge difference to them. I still hear those kinds of stories when I get with alums, wherever I am. I hear, oh, you said this one thing that has stayed with me. And I'm like, well, that must be the work of the Holy Spirit, because I don't remember saying that, but I'm so grateful. So the joys are enormous, and the pain is also difficult, because there's, I used to think that, probably still think that chaplains are worth their weight in gold, even if they don't do anything else, when they manage a crisis, because managing crisis is what we know how to do. And most people around the university don't know what to do in a crisis. And so if we don't do anything else, when we manage a crisis, we are worth our weight in gold to a university. But those crises then take their toll, and then you have to go be with somebody who understands, or rest, or sleep, or run, or throw shoes at the wall, or do whatever feels appropriate. I used to, in the days when we could recycle glass only in one bin, I would take my glass down, and I call it my aggression session. And I would throw one piece of glass in the bin at a time and just hear it crack and shatter and think, oh, this just makes me feel so much better. Telling all my secrets now, but I probably was less good at the self-care piece, but just intuitive things like that did help me a lot.
In listening to you talk about that, the relationships that have extended beyond your time at Hollins or Elon or the colleges where you've served, there's a big difference between that and the experience that parish priests have when you leave. And usually it's not the congregant leaving, it's the priest leaving. But to maintain healthy boundaries, there has to be a severing of the relationship. There should be a severing of the relationship if it's handled appropriately and well. So there's that sudden break. But for you, there's this graceful, it's not you leaving them, you're sending forth these others out into the world and sending with love and prayers and able to continue following. So I think that's a really beautiful difference between chaplaincy and parish ministry. Because as a parish priest, when I left my first church to come to the church where I'm currently served, that was not what happened. It was, I'm leaving, God be with you, prayers for your next priest, and that was it. And there was no continuing relationship. So there's definitely a much more wonderful aspect of maintaining that in the chaplaincy.
It's still true. It's still true with chaplaincy insofar as, when I retired, when I left Hollins and went to another place, it was fortunate that it was far away, and I wasn't then hanging over the shoulder of the new chaplain who was hired. So there is that same dynamic in which, because at one of the universities where I worked, the former chaplain was still around and made my life so difficult. I mean, it can happen. So those healthy boundaries are useful, but the relationships, you can't love somebody that deeply and care about them and then never think of them again. And so with the availability of, say, Facebook and Instagram and ubiquitous telephones, we can pick those relationships up. I don't have long-standing relationships with every student I serve, but But if you love somebody, you still love them. And when you run into a former parishioner at the walk in Washington, you'll still love them.
Oh, absolutely.
Though you
absolutely.
can't be their rector or their priest in the same way that their current rector is, but the love abides.
Absolutely. Absolutely. From a practical aspect, you know, considering the role that you've had as a multi-faith chaplain, just from a practical perspective, a question I've got is, do colleges make the decisions on how many chaplains to have to cover the different faith traditions of the student body based on student population size, or is it purely a fiscal consideration, or is it a testament to the gift of the chaplain they're calling, that they have the ability to speak to a diversity of faiths?
Well, I think it's all of those.
Okay.
Most universities can't afford to hire, 14 chaplains.
Right.
So if they get somebody who has the capacity to cultivate relationships and build communities with more than one, then that's very good. Now, when I went to Elon, I was hired to build a multi-faith center and a multi-faith community. So I built programming, I hired chaplains. I didn't hire 14, I hired 4. And that over time. So depending on the resources of the university and the argument of the chaplain to say, we don't have a multi-faith program if we don't have, say, a Muslim chaplain and a Jewish chaplain to go along with Christian chaplains. Some people think that only Christians can minister across the board.
Yeah.
But if you have a Muslim chaplain, they're going to only want to talk to Muslims. Well, that's ridiculous. We train people to do what they need to do. So the finances of things are important, because not every, especially a small university will hire one chaplain and say, figure out who's out there and how to meet their needs. So I became an expert at finding, okay, where are the Hindu communities gathering in this city? Or are there Buddhist gatherings to sit meditation somewhere that I can make available to my students? Because I can be in relationship to these students and care for them, but I can't lead them. I'm not a Buddhist. I'm not a Hindu. I'm not anything but a Christian. So the discipline of learning to be in relationship and learning to find what are those other resources. Like, I think the other thing I was good at that I think clergy probably ought to be good at is knowing who are the counselors in my city, right?
Yeah.
So when somebody from my parish needs a therapist, I can say, oh, I have a list of reputable therapists that I trust to send you to. Well, in the same way, we do that with religious communities. Here's a religious community that a woman would be like, so my students would say, where could I go where I'd be welcome as a woman, or I'd be welcome as a gay or lesbian person, or I'd be welcome as a person who doesn't ascribe to all of the said beliefs of that religion, but I want to be in community with them. So it behooves a chaplain to know about those things and to make it our business to find out.
Yeah.
So who's around us and where do they worship? Where do they pray? Where do they gather in community? Yeah.
Well, I want to turn more directly to the book now. And I want to say it's a much different devotional book, because this is not a book, and we alluded to this a little bit earlier in the conversation. This is not a devotional book where you've collected prayers. These are prayers that you have actually written over the course of your vocation and over the course of your life. I mean, I remember in the book, I think you said you first realized you wanted to be a chaplain when you were 11. So somewhere these prayers have been percolating within you for, even back into your youth. As you were doing this, not only the book, but writing these prayers over the years, what's your process like when as opposed to extemporaneous prayer where it's like, hey, would you do this? And you've literally got to come up with it on the spot. But what's your process and your discernment like when you actually have the time to sit and think about what you want to include?
So I often, being trained as a writer and a poet, I often would be sort of compelled or touched by an image. I would be walking and see the moon, and somehow those images, I felt like God was speaking to me in those images. A few of the prayers in this book just came to me as they were.
Mm-hmm.
And then some of them, I just had an image and I just built on that. And I, more than that, it just sort of came, many of them just came flowing out of me. Mm-hmm. And like poems do, where a phrase would just rattle around in my head. And I thought, this is what I'm praying for the community right now. Mm-hmm. I did often think about, what does our community need? What needs to be said out loud? What's the moment of history that we live in that somebody needs to be talking about? What an injustice or a funny thing that we all know about, but we haven't shared, or a sadness. What's the burden of the community right now? Mm-hmm. So I tried to make myself cognizant of what are people bearing or experiencing right now, and is there something I can speak to, or is there a way I can open that up to some reflection? Mm-hmm. As we enter this moment together. So I usually tried to have a theme or an idea or an image or and sometimes a playful one.
I have to ask about the editing process. Traditionally I would, and I've never had a book published. I've gotten plenty of rejections for short stories, but nothing published. But in thinking about the editing process, I know if it's a biography or a novel or a nonfiction narrative, the editing process is different. But when you go to church publishing with the manuscript, with prayers that you've shaped over the years, what's the editing process like at their end? Where is there reluctance to, okay, this is the prayer that you've come up with, we really don't want to touch anything? Or is there an editing process even involved with the prayers in this book where they ask you to go back and revisit something?
They didn't. It started with a proposal. I didn't yet have the book written. I had piles and piles of manuscripts, both in my computer and on my dining table, that I had saved, because over the years, so many people have said to me, you need to publish these prayers. And so I had somehow saved them for the moment, never thinking that I actually would. But one more person said that to me, and said, I'm going to connect you with my editor at Church Publishing, and here you go. And they didn't bat an eye, they accepted it, and they didn't tinker with any of the prayers. They ask, apparently I'm prone to make up words. And I will write a word that sounds like the word it should be, but isn't. I'll add a syllable, and it makes perfect sense to me. So they did come back to me and say, did you mean this or that? And I would have to choose, because it's not in this book if it's not in the dictionary. Mm-hmm. So I did have to change a few words, but nobody changed a prayer or asked about what's the theological import of this prayer that I can't get a hold of. It's entirely mine. And the biggest decision was, does the divine person, as I address them, get capitalized or not? And in the end, I was reassured that in the Book of Common Prayer, the divine you is not capitalized. Mm-hmm. So then I was like, oh, that's even better. That's wonderful. So there was there was no editorial heavy hand in anything except the copy editor who knew that I had made some words up. Words that I think were descriptive and I really liked, but they don't appear in here.
Were you ever tempted to respond and say, no, that's exactly what I meant?
Well, I did several times, and the copy editor said, but it's not in the dictionary. You can't use that word. It's not in the dictionary.
Yeah.
Oops. Well, it made perfect sense at the time, and the people who heard it didn't argue with me, but you know, it's the difference between the oral and the written form.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things I loved that I saw in this book was the mention that you made of crafting parts of the prayers in such a way that it shifts the prayer inward. And you use the example, I think, of rather than saying, keep us, saying instead, may we be kept. And making just that slight little change in the language, but pulling the prayer in rather than it being something that going out. And as I was reading that, I was thinking how many times over the years I've heard people say how difficult it is for them to pray, or they don't feel that their prayer matters. You can sense that they've kind of slipped away. They don't do it because they just don't see anything coming out of it. With that phrase in mind about turning it inward, and you also talk about prayer as something being embodied rather than just words being read off a page, what would you say to somebody, in your role as a chaplain, for instance, somebody comes to you and says that I'm trying to pray and it's just not working. How would you guide them along those ways, using the turning inward and the embodying and that sort of thing, where prayer becomes something that's meaningful to them again?
Mm-hmm. So I would ask what I ask in this book, which is, who is the prayer for, right? Or to. So who are you addressing, and what is the nature of to whom you address, right? Are you addressing God who is far away, or is there a spark of God in you, or is there a holy element in you? I'm not trying to be pantheistic. I'm trying to say, you know, we can speak to our we can speak to our own wholeness in prayer, or we can call forth our own wholeness. I think we aspire to that, and I think God wants that for us. And we spend so much of our lives dividing ourselves up into acceptable portions, or you know, what the case I make in the preface is the mind and the heart. And we go to college and we engage our minds, and our hearts get left behind. And so much of education has been unreflective, like just know these things, but how does it contribute to our wholeness? So I think that whatever contributes to the healing of ourselves, it becomes a prayer. So who do you want to be in your wholeness, and how do you want to move forward? What part of you have you left behind that you want to go back and bring along? I think that's a question I have kept asking in this book. What are the parts of ourselves that are getting left behind, that need mention, that we need to talk about, or we need at least to reflect upon? In my work training chaplains now, I ask them always to use feeling words, because so many chaplains have, so much chaplaincy training has been about theology and scripture and about out there, but I want to know who you are in here. And what is it that you bring to the world that's rich and powerful, that never gets seen? And so there's so much of my own search for wholeness that's embodied in this book, but I do think that prayer, I would say, I have sometimes said to students, Get to the end of the day and write down 3 things that pleased you or brought you joy or made you grateful. And that can be your prayer. So just notice how to be grateful. And then wherever you find to lift that, to whomever you find to lift that, maybe it's just in yourself, maybe it's to God, maybe it's out into the wind and the universe, then do it. You know, so find something to be grateful. I think gratitude is a great route for prayer. And most of what I write is in that vein, right? To notice what we sometimes don't notice and to bring together things that don't really in many other venues get brought together, and then offer that as your prayer, like a prayer for who I want to be in the end, the whole person I want to become.
You said something just now that made me think of this. In religion classes you may have taught in your capacity as a chaplain at the different universities, was prayer writing ever a component? I know your background in English and creative writing and poetry, and I'm wondering, is that something that you ever incorporated where you had the students sit and try and write a prayer based kind of on those parameters? What's something you've been grateful for? What's something that's troubling you?
I never did that. I wish I had now, and I thank you for that. I am doing that in the course I'm teaching tomorrow night. I'm asking my students to write a prayer. I'm asking them to write a letter to first-year students. And what do they want to say to students about encountering the university in their first year? That's a process, a developmental moment, as well as the process of, so you have to understand the development of young adults, and then you have to understand how they might change in the first year and how to communicate with first year, 18-year-old students. So I am doing some of that now. But yeah, that would be a great idea. Or we did one time in a confirmation class, write a creed. We took the creed and we looked at the different pieces of it. And I said to the young people in that confirmation class, what do you affirm? What could you affirm in given your life? And so they wrote it, and it was beautiful. It was amazing.
Yeah. One of the things I like about this book, and for those who've not yet gotten a copy, and again, I do encourage you, and at the end of the episode, I will encourage you even once again to get a copy of this. But this is not just you open it up and you're reading straight through. Or Jan, I love the way you've got the prayers categorized into 6 different areas that are meaningful to the life of college students and those in the academic environment, the transition and change, challenge, crisis, and grief, justice, wonder and hope, gratitude that you were just talking about, and different occasions in the life of a campus over the course of the year. And as I was reading through the book and seeing the structure that you gave, in a way, you almost shaped the prayers to kind of give the academic year a liturgical flow. In a way that, that sort of flow is not something you think of in the academic year or the life of college students or that sort of thing. For somebody who is a campus chaplain, multi-faith or single faith, depending on the size and budget and necessity, how would you, if it's something you've even thought about actively, how would you encourage them to give sort of a liturgical flow or a liturgical shape, even though it's not a structured liturgy, but just that flow or feel to the academic year, where it's not just moments, which is something else I want to ask you about, but there's a cohesive journey from beginning to end of the year?
Well, one of the things that I struggled with in this, I'm coming to the answer of that. One of the things I struggled with putting this book together is that most of the time I would write a public prayer for a campus moment, for an occasion. And I didn't want to just say, well, here are the graduation prayers and here are the opening convocation prayers. That felt really kind of stilted and not very useful. So I had to really challenge myself and dig in harder to figure out what is to do what I ask others to do, and that is to figure out what is the feeling in this moment. Mm-hmm. Not just so you're coming to campus for the first time. What are you feeling? And you're leaving campus. What are you feeling? I do that intuitively, but with this book, I had to be very conscious and very intentional about discovering what that feeling was, mm-hmm. and then categorizing according to the feeling of the occasion or the moment or the prayer, rather than the occasion for which I wrote it. Because I do want these prayers to be useful in other moments besides the ones I wrote them for. Mm-hmm. So I also think about that in, there are thresholds that we are transversing, right? That there are these liminal moments of moving from home to college, the way most people do it, mm-hmm. in the traditional age, is a liminal threshold of holiness. And we could see that as a holy journey if we gave ourselves permission to do it. Mm-hmm. Our first relationship, our first adult relationship, our first drink, our first alcoholic drink should be a moment of intentional insight rather than accident. Mm-hmm. So could we begin to see the changes that are enormous, fraught changes of young adulthood as moments stepping over threshold after threshold after threshold? Mm-hmm. And could we see that as a sacred time instead of, oh, I just have to get through this, or, yeah. Oh, this is going to be fun. I mean, we have, I think chaplains have, and parents too, right, have the capacity to say, and maybe the obligation to say, where's the spirit of life in this moment for you? Mm-hmm. So prayers at given moments, I think I really was trying to summon the great spirit of life to be present at this one moment. And in this one life, or in this one event. Not to say, I mean, just to draw attention to something we might be missing, mm-hmm. or something we could see beyond just the moment.
Sure.
So now I've used the moment idea, and you were going to ask about it, but maybe you need to wait a minute.
Well, no, and it's actually a good segue that you mentioned the moment, because there's you talk in there, and there's a wonderful line about how ministry with students, and I'm paraphrasing here, is a revolving door, and you only have one possible moment to offer a blessing for a student, and it's the moment you're in right then. It's not looking ahead to, what can I pray for them on Thursday or Friday? How can I reach them Saturday or Sunday? It's in that moment right there. And it kind of pulled me up short, because somebody that's used to planning a liturgical year and services weeks out in advance, even with a funeral or a wedding, you've got at least a few days ahead. Mm-hmm. But to be confronted with that line of, you've got one chance to reach this person and be with this person, and it's right now, mm-hmm. almost stripped the importance of everything else away. And again, it pulled me up short in reading that, because I don't think in individual moments, I think in blocks of time and preparation. So I'm grateful for you mm-hmm. putting that in there.
Well, it was very clear to me, especially on a campus where people are coming and going, especially a big campus, mm-hmm. people are coming and going, and you may never meet most of them. Mm-hmm. So when you run into them at the 7-Eleven on the corner, that may be all you've got. I think
Yeah.
that about the people that we are in ministry with, maybe outside the parish, right? People that we run into at the grocery store that we don't know, that we have a chance to bless, but we may never think of that. And I don't always live that way, right? I go about my business mindlessly like everybody else. But I do think that when we make a connection with a human being, it's a blessing. And God must be there. And the spirit of life must be there. And if we were more aware of that, we might take those accidental moments seriously.
Yeah.
Or more seriously. I mean, people, if we are in the business of blessing people and inviting God into our relationships with people, then wherever we meet them, it might be our one and only opportunity to speak words of blessing.
And I think one of the most powerful things about those moments is, you and I could encounter somebody and we go back and we think about that moment. We have no idea what seed was planted and how that's going to impact their life, if it impacts their life in a month or a year. So there's the enormity of not knowing the full impact of what it is we've done when we've had those moments.
And that's why planning is good, and I'm for planning, but then we have to live our lives. And what we do in the moments that we didn't plan are as important to ministry, to God, to the gospel, how we embody all of that in the rest of our lives is equally important, and is the match set to what we do. So the plans we make for Sundays, right?
Yeah. Well, I want to pause here before I get into the final set of questions I've got. And I want to ask you if you would read for us the prayer wrestling on page 13, just to give folks a beginning flavor of your voice that they're going to hear in these prayers.
Okay. Source of challenge and change, we ask for blessing at the threshold of the year. We already give thanks for safe arrival, energy, and sense of humor, for minds and souls and gifts, for the people we are and will become. Give us grace to wrestle with wisdom and befriend you, light and guide. Offer your persistence and patience through every thrill and disappointment, every differing opinion and hope, problem and joy, until we perceive its gift and claim its blessing. Bless our coming out, bless our coming in and our going out, so to hold on for blessing and find it all to be sacred, that every aspect of our lives, singly and together, would sing your praise, bless your name, and fill you with delight. Blessed be.
Thank you. There were so many that jumped out at me. I'm going to ask you at the end of our conversation to read one more, but that's just a sample of the gift that you've given. And I guess the last question I want to ask about this book is about the potential of the gift for others. I know it was written specifically for college chaplains, but talk for a minute, if you would, about how this can be utilized, not just by college chaplains, but by parish priests, by clergy and other contexts. And even for me as a parent, it resonated with me because my wife and I, our oldest, is a junior in college. So this resonated with me in a way that, it might not with somebody whose kids are younger or already beyond college or something like that. So talk a little bit about how this could be a resource for them, because as much as kids struggle in college and are looking for things or reaching for things they've left behind, parents are without question the same way with their kids in college. So I think there's so much of a broader range this book could be utilized by. So I wonder if you just talk about that for a little bit.
So I did have lengthy conversations with the publisher about that, because I think it is clearly aimed for students, people who work with students. So high school teachers and chaplains, and but my own sense of it is that, and it is, and a lot of chaplains have talked to me about the book and have wanted it and needed it. But it seems to me that the nuances of, if you're in search of a whole life, I mean, if you appreciate reflective prayers that invite you into yourself rather than outward to a divine figure, but if the divine lives in us, and it is incarnate in us too, then this book is for you. If you're looking for words that I sought for words that were balancing and unbalancing. So I live in that rhythm myself, of getting myself off balance and wondering what I could learn in that moment. So if you're looking for a way to kind of open a different part of yourself, or open a different kind of a different part of yourself spiritually, this might be a good book for you. I do think, as you mentioned, it's a great book for parents. And I've heard from the parents of some of my current or former students who have written to me to say, should I buy this book for my daughter who's moving to France to start a new life? And my answer is yes, because I've prayed these prayers over students, but if in every transition, if we look for a blessing, then you might find some words in here that really ring in your heart, or that bring you peace, or that offer you a way to see a new event or a new experience in a different way. I think so much of what I intended in this book is for these prayers to be models for your prayers. I mean, I think use the prayers if they work for you, but shift them up and use language that makes sense to you. So I hope they'll be models of how to pray. Whenever I write a prayer for a large community, I'm praying, it's me, I'm praying this, and it's coming out of my heart and my life and my attempt to make sense of the moment we're in, or the moment we're about to be in, or what we're about to experience. So much of it is about making meaning in my own mind. So much of this book is about making meaning. Of even the silliest things, or the smallest things, or the largest things, that that's a human impetus, and we're all trying to do that,
right?
In our faith and in our faithfulness and in our prayers. Then check it out and see if this book is useful in a way of making meaning in your life or somebody else's life.
Well,
I'm not trying to market the book so much as answer your question, but I think I was hoping that it would help many more than students and chaplains and parents.
Yeah, and I think it's again, speaking as a parent, that's one of the ways that hit me with in multiple ways. As a priest, I'm impacted by powerful prayers. As somebody that loves stories, I'm impacted obviously by the story of your life and your journey. But then as a parent of a college student, and married to somebody who was impacted by you, and having been in that realm of Holland students those years ago, it's multiple impacts for me. So thank you for it. I'd like to end. I'm going to ask you, if you would, to read one more prayer. And I think this is my favorite one out of all of the ones in the book. It's Sweet Summary of Thanks on page 1. I think it's 138. So I'll ask you to close our time together with that.
I am grateful for students and colleagues from whom we learn and whom we serve, a sense of humor, words of respect and support, people who tell us the truth, leaders who know and hold us in esteem. I am thankful for amazing people, friends, and family who bless us, for infinite shades of green, magnolia blossoms in the yard, sun and rain, new smelling books that offer the promise of escape or growth, small movements toward justice, reconciliation, and hope. I praise for work that measures quality, challenges that hurt our brains, hearts that bring us to tenderness, even tears, lunch that offers nourishment and laughter, the blessing of enough, time to think, coffee, comfortable shoes, friends, breath that animates us today, which we dare not take for granted. Friends, I'll say it again, friends, the beloveds who have gone ahead of us, time, sight, awe, excellence, and this one moment. May gratitude shape us as recipients of these blessings and more, and may their measurements be our service to others. Let us be a sweet summary of thanks.
And I will say thanks. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Yeah, thank you.
For those watching or listening who might want to follow more of your journey, contact you to talk about the book, what's the best way for folks to follow along with what you're doing?
I write me at jfuller3@elon.edu. I'm in the Diocese of Southwest Virginia like you are, and I'm around and would love to hear from folks who want to talk about it.
Great, and I'll have that in the notes at the end of this video and then in the program notes for the audio version as well. So Jan, it's such a joy in the midst of your busy life to have some time with you and catch up, and especially again to talk about this book that's a gift. Thank you for writing it. I know friends who are college chaplains have gotten it. I have no doubt many clergy colleagues are getting it, and while you may not want to sit here and necessarily market the book, let me do it. It's well worth the purchase. And so thanks to Church Publishing for giving you this opportunity.
Thanks, Matt. I sure appreciate it.
It's good to see you. Take care. God
Thanks.
bless.
All right. Thank you. You too.